Well, welcome once again to all of our audience for Churchill Borough C1 District Planning and Visioning Project. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining our webinar called The Market. My name is Elaine Kramer, and I am a community planner with Pashik MTR. And I'm here with our founding partner, Jim Pashik, as well as my colleague, Keely McDonald, and Tess DeYoung from Connect. I'm so pleased to welcome you all and hope you're staying safe these days, staying well, and thank you for finding the bandwidth to join us tonight. You should be able to see an informational slide on the screen while everybody gets settled in, and you should be able to see and hear the panelists as we get going. We really do appreciate your interest in this planning and visioning project. In just a minute, we'll introduce the panelists who are participating in tonight's discussion. But first, I want to give you a brief introduction to the project. We're here tonight because Churchill Borough decided to undertake a community planning and visioning project regarding the future of its C1 commercial district. And the C1 district is the part of the borough that it's right here, it's light blue. C on this map stands for commercial and R for residential. So the district is the part of the borough that many residents know as the former Westinghouse site. This visioning project is asking residents of Churchill what you would like to see happen at this site in the future. The Visioning Project is an outgrowth of Churchill's comprehensive planning project. So back in 2016 and 17, Churchill, Monroeville, and Wilkins banded together and worked together to create a comprehensive plan. That's a 10-year plan, a long-term plan. That was adopted by all three communities in 2018. So one of the recommendations was for Churchill to proactively plan for what could happen in this large part of the community. It has had little use for many, many years now. And so that comprehensive plan begat this planning and visioning initiative. Let me talk for a minute about how tonight's webinar fits into the bigger picture of this project. There's a 6-part webinar series like this one, and they're panel discussions that are designed to help residents learn more about the possibilities of new development at the C1 district and become engaged in the visioning process. This webinar is the very last one of the series, and so we want you to know that they're all being recorded or have been recorded, and you can see them at churchillborough.com. Besides this, many of you know that there's a questionnaire, a community questionnaire that you can fill out either online or on paper, and you can find that at churchillborough.com or call the borough office. Now, about this webinar, here are some logistics. As I said, it's being recorded for later viewing. At any time up through, as we go through the webinar, we would love it if you would submit questions for the panel, because I have the wrong one here. But at 8:10, we will do a panelist Q&A. That will be at 8:10. The way you can add your questions is to activate the black bar on your Zoom window and then type in a question and hit enter, and that will become visible to the panelists. And the questions will be saved for the project steering committee as well. We also wanted to mention that we've taken precautions as best we could to prevent Zoom bombing, which is any inappropriate interruption of this meeting. So if you see something like that, that means that we have had reason to terminate the webinar. And we just wanted to take those precautions, but we don't expect that to happen. It hasn't on any of the first 5, and we're expecting and looking forward to a wonderful workshop tonight. So to get started, we want to show you two more maps that we hope will get everybody oriented, and then we'll introduce our panelists. So this is a community context map showing the shape of Churchill Borough. And this is the parkway. It kind of runs through it. You see the main corridors are Beulah Road and Greensburg Pike as well. And the lighter yellow lines are roads, and then these white rectangles you see are the building footprints. And the community is surrounded by Penn Hills, Wilkinsburg, Forest Hills, Wilkins, with Monroeville and Pittsburgh out just a bit further. Now, these are residential streets in most cases, but here along Rodi Road, you can see the larger white rectangles that indicate that those are larger commercial buildings. And you see some other large footprints throughout Churchill Borough. Here's Woodland Hills Junior Senior High School, the big Beulah Presbyterian Church, and of course the large buildings on the old Westinghouse site in the C1 district. Now this purple area is the area that we're talking about tonight. And then here's a aerial blow up of that, so you can take a closer look. You can see again the parkway up here, Beulah Road, Greensburg Pike, and then Lewin Lane is the southern border. There's a pond and a stream, mostly culverted, but there's a stream that comes through, and this is part of the Turtle Creek watershed. The C1 district is a total of just under 150 acres, with the small parcel here being 13, and this larger parcel being 133. So my fun fact is that this was the building, and the site was designed in the 1950s when Westinghouse developed the site to appear from the air as a locomotive, because Westinghouse was a manufacturer of locomotive air brakes, and when executives were from other companies or other firms were coming in and flying into Pittsburgh, they wanted this to look like a locomotive from the air, so it would be very recognizable. So that's a little tidbit that I just love. Right here, if you can see it, is the sign that's visible from the parkway, and then the site slopes down, 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 and heads on downhill. So that's a really brief introduction to the site. And I'm going to stop screen sharing now so we can introduce our panelists. We will start in just a second, but this group is just a fantastic group who have expertise in development, in market conditions, in understanding how development and government work. And they are also able to speak about the roles and expectations of the owner, of developer, of a borough or government agency. So we're so pleased that they volunteered to participate. We thank them. And we'd like to start the introductions with Lance Chipka. Lance became Director of Allegheny County Economic Development in 2018. As director, he leads the county agency responsible for business expansion, community development, planning, real estate development, and affordable housing projects for the county. He previously worked with the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development, where he was regional director of the Governor's Action Team and directed the state response for business attraction and expansion activities. Prior to working with the state, he led community development programs, commercial lending, business attraction and expansion activities for Allegheny County Economic Development. He holds a bachelor's in business administration and finance from the Catholic University of America in Washington, and an MS in public policy and management from CMU. He's also certified as an economic development finance professional and served in the Peace Corps in Turkmenistan.
As did Eileen, I found.
Yes, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Sierra Leone.
All right, that's a separate Zoom meeting. We'll talk about all
Ray Gastel. Ray is director of the Remaking Cities Institute at Carnegie Mellon, where he is engaged in teaching and research on sustainable urbanism and architecture. He was director of the Pittsburgh Department of City Planning from 2014 to 2019, where he led divisions and initiatives, including strategic planning, neighborhood planning, community engagement, public art and civic design, zoning and development review, historic preservation, and GIS. Some initiatives included Complete Streets, the Eco-Innovation District, neighborhood planning, riverfront zoning, and affordable housing policy. His experience includes comprehensive city and regional planning with focus on planning and urban design frameworks for campuses, mixed-use districts, neighborhoods, waterfront development, and public spaces. He previously was planning director in Seattle and the Manhattan office director for New York City planning. He holds a Master of Architecture degree from Princeton.
Hello.
Jared Imperatore is vice president for retail brokerage at Jones Lang LaSalle Real Estate Services Pittsburgh office. Jared brings 26 years of business experience to the understanding of retail requirements from a landlord and tenant perspective with respect to present and future goals. He's highly skilled at negotiating business terms, return on investments, risk management, and aligning clients' business objectives and core values. He applies his knowledge and insights to the agency leasing and tenant representation services he provides to an extensive roster of retail clients. He holds a Bachelor of Science from Point Park and an Architecture Design Associate's degree from Pittsburgh Technical College. He's received some of the commercial real estate industry's highest awards, the CoStar President's Club Award and CoStar Market Share Award in 2006. And he was a CoStar Group's Power Broker recipient from 2007 to 2013. And he's an active member of the International Council of Shopping Centers, which is the ICSC, in case that comes up later. And finally, I want to introduce you to Nick Makarev. Nick is a planner and local government policy specialist with the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development for Southwestern PA, based out of Pittsburgh. He supports municipalities and local government officials with assistance and support, including funding information, legislative research impacting local governments, community planning assistance, coordination of services, and technical assistance. And I might add at this point that DCED is one of the funders of this planning and visioning project, along with Churchill Borough is funding the project as well. Nick holds a master's in community planning from the University of Maryland, College Park. He previously worked as a consultant for Hartford County, Maryland on a small area community plan and worked for the Economic Opportunities Program at the Aspen Institute in Washington, DC. So thank you so much to the panelists for jumping in tonight. We really appreciate your expertise and your time. Thank you so much. And I'm turning it over to Jim.
Thank you, Elaine. So this is the market, this webinar, and we're talking about characteristics of market and social trends in redevelopment, the needs and expectations of property owners, and developers and communities, the needs of the developers and communities. We have a number of questions that we'd like to ask the panelists, and we've decided to cluster these questions into kind of common topic areas, and we're going to go through them. There's 3 or 4 questions for each one. We'll start off with site suitability questions, then market conditions, development processes and approvals, community impacts, development impacts for transportation, and eventually, if we have time, development impacts of natural resources. So that's how we're going to do this. In terms of site suitability, we'd like to start by understanding the acreage. It's a large site in terms of redevelopment. And it's about, as Elena described, about 150 acres for both parcels, 133 for the old Westinghouse research site. And I wanted to ask Nick if he might have some examples of other large-scale redevelopment projects that he has seen around the area that residents of Churchill might be aware of to understand the size of this project?
Yeah, I think one of the there's a lot of redevelopment going on everywhere. Of course, it's happening around the United States, but here specifically, something that's similar size. Now, it wasn't a redevelopment of the whole property, but more infill. Was the South Side Works in South Side. It's about 134 acres. Of course, most of you probably know it for being mostly retail, but it is retail, residential. Another one is the Waterfront in Homestead, mostly commercial, but is also probably of similar size to what you're looking at in Churchill.
Terrific, thank you. This next question is for Jared and then maybe followed by Ray. We asked this question in the previous workshop on site design and design standards, but we wanted to come back to it from the development perspective. When thinking about redevelopment, terrain is always consideration. We're talking about site suitability. The C1 district has some flat areas and some hills and valleys. How do different forms of development occupy a terrain like this differently? Have you had experience with that, Jared? Or?
Well, actually, I do. The couple projects that I'm currently working on, the Lower Hill District, which is anchored by PPG Paint, has a hill and terrain difference from Washington Way up to the Hill District. We decided to create the commercial real estate part of it between the PPG Paint and then do residential going up towards the hill. So we've basically separated the development into residential and then commercial down below.
Great, thank you. Ray, have you got some thoughts in terms of this challenging terrain and how development works with that?
Well, it's challenging terrains. You respond to them differently depending on your resources and how much on your resources and how much you really are willing to take risks with them. I mean, for example, Carnegie Mellon's campus, Carnegie Mellon University's campus, is actually 153 acres. It's very similar in size to this site. That may be an interesting context. And one other context I wanted to give people was that the across from Southside Works, the Hazelwood Green development, which is only sort of starting, is about 178 acres. That gives you maybe a little bit of a sense of how big this is and how. And one other example I just can't help myself from giving is the Apple campus, which is the ultimate gold-plated version of what you do with 175 acres. With 12,000 employees. It's another, people want to look it up. It's an interesting kind of reference point about all this. The campus, but when you think about these challenges, and I know the Lower Hill, but think about Carnegie Mellon. Carnegie Mellon has, because it needed to build in terms of its plan, it actually has grouped a number of buildings, especially in its science realm, against the cut, which happens right there, and which is a very steep gully of the hollow that's right adjacent to the campus. But because they had the resources and also the space problem of where to put it, they put the resources to build what are very technically challenging buildings in terms of like making sure that they're stable on a site like that. If you have choices, and increasingly in a kind of climate change environment where our hillsides are not nearly as stable as they were, I think that the more likely way to build in this region these days is going to be relatively conservative about that, unless you have a really special situation like Carnegie Mellon.
Thank you, Ray. And this is a question for anyone, although I'm kind of thinking of Jared or Lance on this specifically, but regrading a site becomes a big part of costs of the redevelopment. And sometimes in Pittsburgh, we have high retaining walls or steep constructed slopes to accommodate buildings and parking lots. And the question is, to what degree does this part of site preparation drive decisions about what development occurs? Who would like to answer that?
I'll wade into that one. Yeah, in southwestern Pennsylvania, in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, there is no such thing as flat, right? Yeah. So when we're dealing with sometimes regional and sometimes national developers, it can be some sticker shock when we present land development and pre-development costs to getting a flat site. I think that's one of the great things about this site is that you have a large buildable tabletop flat site, which is somewhat rare in the region. And to Ray's point, I think there are two ways to deal with topography issues. You can either fight against it or you can work with it. And in this particular site case, I think it provides kind of an interesting opportunity to segment the site between a more active development site and maybe a less active, more passive site that is going to have too many development challenges from a wetlands perspective and a topography change perspective. You're not going to want to mess with that. To Ray's point, it's just for I think what the market will bear on that site. It's not a cost worth incurring, and I think it's probably a benefit to the community to not attempt to mess with Mother Nature too much. It rarely is.
Thanks, Lance. Does anyone else have anything to add to that? All right, let's switch to market conditions and trends. I'm going to start with Lance. We'll go around the room. Owners and developers' proposals are highly influenced by supply and demand for certain types of development. What kinds of development or uses are in short supply or are overbuilt in our area? We're going to two extremes there, either in short supply or overbuilt. And we'd like to ask each of you, starting with Lance, what is it that might be used for this site? What are your visions? What do you see as an opportunity for Churchill site? So Lance, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. It's really hard to answer this question without obviously addressing the elephant in the room, which is the kind of the economic and real estate response to COVID-19. But I think what we're seeing is that the real estate markets are going to be, the trends in the real estate markets that existed pre-COVID-19 are going to be amplified post-COVID-19 with one extension, which I'll talk about in a minute. So broadly speaking, you have a retail market that was extremely troubled, right, due to the rise of online sales, due to a number of factors, right? I think we will see that retail market continue to be extremely depressed moving forward. It'll be one of the last industries to recover from an economic recession, and certain consumer preferences have been accelerated, and the use of online commerce has just been completely normalized at this point, to the point where my 78-year-old mother says she vows she'll never step in another grocery store again. So retail, really, really challenged market. Plus, we're overbuilt in retail to begin with, those market conditions notwithstanding. Industrial regionally is thriving. It was pre-COVID, and I think with that trend will continue for two reasons. One, I'll put warehousing and distribution into the industrial bucket, which will take up all the demand from that retail due to online distribution. But also, I think our manufacturing base has a huge opportunity to take some of the reshoring capabilities that I think a lot of people are really reconsidering their supply chains and reconsidering their reliance on single countries in those supply chains. And I think our industrial base has the opportunity to absorb some of those reshoring activities. The Class A office market, I think, is the big wild card. You'll find divergent opinions on this. I think you have two factors at play. The trend that will not continue was there was a trend of decreasing square foot per person, really packing people into office buildings. That is obviously not tenable in a post-COVID social distancing environment. So you're going to see that trend start to reverse. However, what's going to offset the demand for more square footage per person is the fact that a lot of business operations are finding productivity in remote work environments. So I think those two things are really going to balance each other out, and we're going to see a stable office environment, but I think you're going to see cautious development emerging from COVID. In the three buckets, no on retail, yes on industrial, and wait on office.
Great, thank you. Nick, what's your thoughts in terms of what's been overbuilt and what are some of the new emerging trends?
I mean, of course, I'm new to, well, you probably don't know, I'm new to the Pittsburgh area. I've only been here since December, so I'm still learning the Southwest region here. looking at examples from what I'm used to, I come from more of the housing community development side of things. So for me, while warehouse and distribution is one angle, I also believe there's opportunity for new housing and the potential for adult housing or senior housing is definitely, with the aging population in this area, an angle that may be of interest in this site.
Great, thank you. Jared? Are you muted?
I'm unmuting myself. Please excuse me.
Okay.
I do retail, and obviously I do retail development or retail from ground up. I was approached by this developer twice over the last 6 years, maybe 7 years, to do an analysis on the land and potential to do retail. That to me was quite easy. I spent probably about 20 hours reviewing it a few years back. My concern with the retail is that you're trying to compete against the Monroeville trade area, which is about 3.4 million square feet of retail. My also concern about the retail in this trade area is that it's a very captured market. So when you get through, anybody living up north most likely aren't going to come to this trade area, as well as west and in the South Hills. So what you're really capturing is just the east side of the market. Then you're turning around and trying to create it against one of the oldest retail trade areas in the market, which is the Monroeville. Then you start looking at consumer buying power, household income, the density, the site ingress, egress, access to the site. A lot of these different variables that I create when I'm looking at development and developing a matrix just does not line up for this type of land in trade area. I do believe there's a shortage in flex space and distribution space. I know that for a fact in the market. If we were to go that route, or your firm or your community, I think we'd have to address the ingress egress into the site to make sure that it doesn't impact the community.
Thank you. Great.
Well, I think most of the market stuff's been discussed. I will note that, from a Pittsburgh perspective, at least until not too long ago, at least before this current crisis, there was still seemed to be the demand for new Class A, and especially kind of let's call it Class A alternative space, was still there, still being built out, especially in the Strip, but not only in the Strip, also up in Lawrenceville and a number of other areas. But it's the kind of trying to create this type of community where the sort of a I call it, it's almost lifestyle Class A, because it's for a generation that doesn't really want to be downtown and is more taken with a kind of environment where there's housing and smaller scale and a mix of uses and so forth, which you can either try and recreate in a campus setting like this or not. I mean, South Point is the most kind of ambitious version of that in the region, at least in the recent years. But I think that in market terms, as was said by Lance, I mean, there's a certain way you have no idea what is happening. I mean, we can't, I think it's a very thoughtful thing to say that basically the trends that were already there will be amplified by this, and I suspect that's quite accurate. But at the same time, how could you think about office right now if you look at the trends that are happening right now, in which the tech companies, as was always expected, now that they actually, Twitter is the one that sort of is the most, it said basically to everyone, you never have to come back to the office, ever. The other ones are saying you don't have to come back to the office until 2021. Some, Apple wants them back sooner because they have a culture of, they also are sort of more connected to production, and they also have a culture of sort of secrecy, for lack of a better term. So I think that we really are really big questions, but I think, again, it may not work for housing for a variety of reasons, but the one thing we actually do know we're going to need more of is housing. And I think that its role in the marketplace may change the market for housing may change. And also, of course, as was stated by Jared, I believe, is like distribution is not going to get smaller through the way that we're living. I mean, the way that goods are moved is going to continue, and that there is demand for that side as well. So the two very different notions. I mean, like either there's going to be there's sort of the unicorn demand for a new special R&D kind of site, which could exist. It's not, seems unlikely at this particular moment, but it could exist. But then the more sort of standard trends, I think, would be around the distribution and potentially housing, although that's a tough one.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to stay with you, Ray, for the next question, which is one of Churchill's goals dating to the comprehensive plan development in 2016 through 18 is for redevelopment in this district to make Churchill more attractive. That puts Churchill on the map. That entices the next generation of people to move into the borough. I know we've started to talk about this, but we're looking at it now from a little bit of a different angle. What uses or types of development are considered to be good bets for that, for attracting the next generation of residents? Do any of these align with some of the major needs that you identified in the last few minutes of housing and those kinds of things? So Ray, I'm going to ask you that question.
Yeah, no, I think that the housing market has not disappeared. It changed even in the years since the 5 years I was planning director. It moved much more towards rental than it had been, or really it was actually much more towards rental than it had been like a decade before. But but it continues. We the investors in housing are sort of, as they sort of are drawn to secondary markets and have been for the past 4 years, rather than just the major cities. They've been drawn to cities like Pittsburgh and the Pittsburgh region. So I think that there's a sense that our housing need is going to rise steadily, not at a rate like Atlanta or Austin or Seattle or those communities, but we still see an increase in the demand for housing and also a different kind of housing product. I think that that's it's not a surprise. And this could be a site which actually provides a different kind of housing, but that's it's a very high bar, because housing, even though returns of 15 or 16% are expected by outside investors, that still housing can be on quite a tight margin and is very vulnerable to fluctuations in the market, at least for rental kind of housing. That said, there's a lot of models of sort of housing developments today that are attractive, and that the site like this, it have to be a very creative version of how housing would work, but you can see it happening. But it couldn't be exclusively housing. It would have to be a mixed-use community. Again, a kind of gold-plated version is Facebook, with all the money in the world, building its Willow campus, its Willow Village, where it's trying to overcome the mistakes of building campuses that were entirely sort of locked out of activities, and so weren't an amenity for the community. That may or may not really go forward at this point, but at the same time, that's a vision, which is a legitimate vision and has worked in many places where you have a job center combined with a new kind of variety of housing types. That can be attractive. Again, whether the market's really there for that is a big question, but at least conceptually, in terms of national perspective, there have been sites that have done that very successfully.
Thank you, Ray. This question's for Jared. The former Westinghouse site grew and flourished for 20 to 30 years, from 1955 up into the 70s and 80s. How far into the future developers look when they identify a project? One of our steering committee members put the question this way: how can we encourage resiliency to withstand market preferences as they change throughout generations? This is when you put your crystal ball on, Jared.
Well, no, absolutely. That is a very complex and interesting question. I don't know the history of Westinghouse. My assumption is that the Westinghouse was built based on location, and I'm assuming the housing was developed around it, and it kind of grew along those lines. The couple developments that I've worked on, South Point Town Center, which is located, it's the South Point Park. It's a business park that has about 4 million square feet of commercial space. That project took easily 15, 16 years to really get rolling. And once the corporate offices and some of the flex and industrial spaces went in, you noticed that the housing started to come around. And then within the last 7 years, last 7 years ago, I ended up finishing the retail within there, which was essentially amenity retail. Another project that's taken 10 years is called Newberry Market that I'm working on in the South Hills, and that's anchored by South Point, or anchored by Topgolf. The housing within Newberry and around Newberry has grown drastically because of accessibility from the airport and to downtown, but also because of the school district. The school district really drives. They were #1 last year, and I believe the school district is #6. They're ranked 6th this year. So when people go looking for housing and homes, they take into consideration the school district. That's a major impact and importance, as well as where they live. It would probably be school
first
district first and where they work second.
Yeah.
That's how. Yep. So that's my. Yep.
Thank you, Jared. This is the last question in this group about market conditions, and I'd like to ask everyone to weigh in on this, but I'm going to start with Lance. So many aspects of our world have changed in the past decade and are changing faster with implications for development. I'd like to ask you, beginning with Lance, to identify a trend, and we've already started to talk about this. On Kurtman, you've mentioned the COVID already. So what kinds of trends, development trends, you've mentioned already the idea of the people now shopping from home. You've talked about the workspace where you work from home. What are some other trends that you're seeing?
Let's see. Geez. Well, I mean, from a national competitiveness perspective,
Yes.
I'll still want to raise examples. And if I'm a Twitter employee, I don't know why I continue to pay housing costs in high value areas if I'm never coming to the office again. And that's where I think Pittsburgh has a lot to offer from an affordability and amenity perspective for someone who is now suddenly relegated to remote work in New York City or Boston or Cupertino or some of these other places. So I guess one trend would be on like a subset of that remote work trend would be, okay, we now have the ability to pick up some new residents, reverse longstanding population decline trends, and to the benefit of the region because it's a affordable and amenity rich place to live and work remotely from. So I guess I'll go with that.
Great, thank you, Lance. Nick, any other trends that we haven't already talked about?
No, I would just like to add, I mean, nationally, I'll go back to the aging population. It's funny, aging populations and early 20s, mid 20s individuals sort of are now looking at the same type of housing options to live in amenity rich areas with, with outdoor recreation, a sense of place, a defined sort of neighborhood. And that's just a trend that's really popular and happening around the United States.
Thank you. Jared, anything you want to add?
I'm going to stick with what I believed pre-COVID, and I still am a strong believer in this, is I believe experiential development and entertainment development is the future. I think we will get back to that. You have to create placemaking, which essentially is an environment that compels somebody that wants to go there and experience that and come back over and over again. And creating that placemaking is I still believe is going to be the future.
Great, thank you. And Ray, close us up on this.
I agree with what's been said. I think that there's the only thing I would caution is with a site like this and with the current conditions. I mean, you're going to have to make some choices about how much flexibility the community really wants to see for it. Because you either, if you're willing to go where the market takes you, if the market takes you to something closer to distribution, that's going to be that's a very different decision than wanting to achieve a experiential kind of lifestyle based sort of public realm, which then is accompanied by a mixed use of housing and retail. That's so I would just, these are all real considerations for the site. I think the one thing I'd note that's not a trend, but there was a trend, which I frankly in a very small way may have pushed a little bit at the sort of the notion that the sort of isolated campus for a corporate campus was no longer a optimal one, and that it really should be more in an urban setting. And that the one thing that this is the sheer speculation side is that COVID may actually make some of the aspects of that isolated one entry place of work all of a sudden seem a little more attractive than it used to seem. I said I wouldn't, we may be surprised that, people are going to say, Apple had it right to put 12,000 people in one building in Menlo Park. So just something to, those are the things, again, I'm talking about stuff that doesn't have the kind of sense of a long sound kind of projection, or rather a scenario. And I think the scenarios that people have suggested are very sensible ones, but I would adopt them as a policy matter. But at the same time, I think we may be in for some surprises about where the trends go, and surprises for a community in terms of what is most attractive to them, really.
Great, thank you, Ray. I just want to stop for a minute before I ask some questions on development process and approvals. Just to mention that the owner has requested an opportunity to make a statement, and we'd like to do that just before our lightning round at 8:25. So, Mr. Wilhelm, if you would be prepared, and Tess, you'll unmute his microphone at 8:25. And I want to mention to those that are attendees to this webinar that to make sure that you come up with any questions you would like to ask the panelists, and use the Q&A function, the bottom screen, and post those questions. And we'll have a few minutes a little bit later to share those questions with the panelists and get some sites. So make sure you include some questions for the panelists on that. So let me go back now to development process and approvals. Our goal of this panel discussion is to shine a light on the needs and expectations of owners, developers, and the jurisdictional bodies. Speaking generally about planning and site development, how do the levers work? How do the levers work? What does an owner, a developer, and a local government have as a right or expectation? So I maybe, Jared, if you would just share with us in terms of owner development, what are the kinds of things that you look at when you think of being involved in a project, and in terms of development process and approvals?
Excuse me. So, so the developments that I'm involved in, and developments that I've worked on that have been successful, I think one is keeping the community informed, letting them know, what your vision is, why your vision's that way, and that typically a smart developer's vision is based on current market conditions and current demands, what uses are out there are expanding and growing, and making sure that you have that connectivity with the township, with the commissioners, and making sure that you illustrate the different options that you reviewed and evaluated, the case studies that you've gone through, and providing that information to help everybody to make a decision. It may be the developer's land, and they may own it, but it is part of the community, and having that community buy-in is important.
Yeah, when you look at potential sites for development, how is the length of time for approvals and the kind of process you have to go through for approvals? How does that affect your decision?
that affects, I'm a broker, so I normally get paid when the deal's done, and I try to work with communities that are, that are open and friendly to opportunities and thoughts, and developers are as well. So there's some, there's some areas that developers and owners know that they need to be cautious because of the lack of cooperation or a lack of willing to work together, and not being able to get through the township and in the approval process.
Thank you very much. So I was wondering, in terms of local government, what they can expect. Nick, I was wondering if you would share what local governments should expect in terms of how a development proceeds through to fruition.
Yeah, well, before even a development, proposal comes in, of course, local government already has, ordinances, zoning, saldo set in place. And that's really how they regulate what type of development can and will occur at a certain site. Usually development review, once it comes into a borough, will be looked at by the local staff and then passed on to the planning commission. And there is actually a 90-day period where a decision has to be made. So generally within a 90-day period, that process will at least have to have some feedback to the developer on the conditions of the site and what and if what their proposal passes.
Thank you. Lance, I know you could look at this question from both directions as a representative of the county and municipalities in our county, as well as someone who's looking to attract businesses into the county. What are some expectations that developers have, and what are some expectations that municipalities have?
Yeah, I think so. I work in 130 different municipalities, many of which have their own planning commissions and own municipal governments. And you can imagine that the level of sophistication, the openness to development, it varies widely amongst the 130 municipalities. So in the instances where I see it go well, and this is more of a philosophy more than, P's and Q's of land ordinances, et cetera. But I think when a community is approached by a developer and they're able to articulate, yeah, I understand the development, but here are our concerns and it's X, Y, and Z, and they're able to clearly articulate that to developers. In many cases, developers want that input and need that input and are happy to help, get beyond some of those challenges. And in the end, when it works very well, it's the betterment, of the community itself. One recent example is in Braddock Borough. We acquired about 60 plus vacant delinquent houses, and that whole area was zoned residential. But it was adjacent to an industrial site. It was really an improper, ill-fitting place for a residential district. And so, just through back and forth and a really good relationship with the borough, we now have a 60,000 square foot vertical farm in that area. That was the region's first opportunity zone project, and has solar panels on the roof, and is a really great example that if we didn't have the relationship in Braddock Borough, that project wouldn't have happened in somewhere else. So I really applaud the borough officials in Braddock for being open-minded, articulating their concerns, and allowing the developer to address them.
Okay, thank you. Ray, I just want to ask you, and I apologize if I'm taking you back to your years as planning director for the city as opposed to your current position, but what are reasonable expectations in terms of municipalities and working with developers?
Well, the baseline is, as was mentioned by Nick, is that, what is your existing zoning? And if your existing zoning has a lot of by right. I mean, things that can be done with without a conditional, with the lowest level of kind of review and approval. And those are viable uses. That's where the developer is going to start. I think that, and so as a city, if you've already written those rules, you have to think long and hard before you change them, because that's a process in itself. That's a serious process of municipal, and you will have the community engaged, and you will have the however the city local government is set up. So, and it will also have potential legal issues. So all of those you have to, especially as a smaller municipality, you have to realize that you do those things when they're what you really want to do, when they're really important, not just it's not a light decision. That said, I think in a municipality like that, so I look at this baseline as the zoning. I think the C1 that's there, while there is some room for variety in the conditional uses, is actually a relatively tight constraint, and certainly does not lend itself to mixed use. And it really, again, it depends a little bit through this visioning process. If the community arrives at realizing it really wants something besides what's allowed with that, or even within that there's certainly a way of distributing the land or the program, then you really, you work on it. And the city has to sort of be able to set the resources to do that work, because otherwise it will not happen. And it's worth doing for a couple reasons if you get there, which is, one is, if you don't, it will come around and what's a polite way to say bite you, whatever. It'll come back to get you later. It's because that's in Pittsburgh. No sites would be named, but there were many sites and when you really got to any kind of scale, we realized that the existing zoning in of itself and even the existing process wasn't really going to be able to take in all the content and concerns that people had. And so we set up some ad hoc, and now I think we've got more of a formal way of doing it that is bigger than that and involves a visioning and on to process. Ultimately, though, it does end up in a new zoning and new regulatory structure. And I think that's one, again, I don't think it's a decision to make lightly. And in fact, if you feel like you can achieve what you want within the existing zoning, but set certain guidelines and so forth, that's one way to go. But otherwise, it's well worth doing, because you do have to change the rules. And government has the right to change the rules on property. I mean, I think, of course, it's in certain arenas, it can be seen as I won't use the word, but it can be seen as unfair. And it's certainly worth considering. But at the same time, it won't work. The process will not work unless you have some general consensus about the future of the site. People, the community will rise up and oppose the project regardless of that starting point if they're unhappy with it. So I think you do have to do this type of work. And it's in the end, it's hard, but it's in the end, it's in the developer's interest as much as it is in the communities. Because one of the ways to describe it's interesting when developers come with their whole version of how they want to change everything and how they want to actually change the zoning and so forth. And that is one way to get the work done, and it's a legitimate, but at the same time, you need some buy-in earlier in the process. And that's where a comprehensive plan and then amplifying aspects of the comprehensive plan to actually drill down to expectations. And I'll just end noting, this is like, I don't know if it's 1/10 of the land mass of this, it's something like 1/10 of this community. And so it's inevitable, no matter who is the holder of this, that there's going to be a community interest, regardless of the regulatory structure and so forth. So you just can't be that big and not be of a matter to a larger public.
Great, thank you. I'd like to just stop for a minute. We probably will come back. We'll have time to come back to a few more questions, but I wondered if Elaine, if you would please post the poll that we developed for this. So the question and to have attendees respond is, having heard what panelists have suggested are potential uses supported by market demand, which one would be your highest choice? And we had to anticipate without knowing what they were going to say. So we picked a few. One is mixed use that includes housing and retail commercial. One is education and research facilities. One is warehouse and distribution. One is flex space. And one is senior housing. So we picked those as part of our poll question. So we'll hold this up for another 60 seconds or so. I'm anxious to have you press the poll button at the bottom of your screen and vote.
while this is up on the screen, I wondered if Jared could explain what flex space is.
Flex space is distribution space that has office within it. So there's an office component, and it could be 50-50 with some warehouse and distribution, but it has an office component to it.
Great, thank you, Jared. So,
It could also be production space, not exclusively warehouse and distribution, but it could be, some sort of office and other mix. High bay production space is also very hot right now for mixed, or for the flex market.
Yeah, I agree.
thank you, Lance. So go ahead and close the poll. And it looks like for the few that voted that mixed use and warehouse and distribution are both preferences, followed by education and flex space and senior housing. So thank you very much for that. So we come to the time where we'd like to take any questions from the attendees. And Keely, has anybody posted any questions? If not, we'll go back to the questions we have.
Yeah, I have a few questions here. Let me see. Do you think that a mixed space commercial, residential, and open space parks development is more likely to thrive in today's environment?
That's to any of you on the panel.
I mean, as opposed to a single use, right? Yeah,
I think that's what they're asking.
Yeah, I think it depends on the site. I do like I think when most people talk about mixed use, they're talking about usually it's people have the conception of mixed office and retail development. But I like that someone is thinking more broadly about a mixture of uses. And for this site, we talked about topography, we talked about potentially embracing topography, and that would be the natural buffer between two uses, perhaps, whether that's an office or passive park use or an industrial passive park use. But I think the site does lend itself to potentially an active development site and a less active site based on the topography changes. So,
Anybody else?
I think it would thrive once you got the financing. I think it will. I mean, what I'm saying, I think if you could actually create a place that people wanted to go to, whether it was had an entertainment aspect or whether it was kind of like just a particularly attractive kind of third place that somehow had some kind of use, if you gave people in that area a kind of different kind of place to go and a different kind of retail experience than they have today, retail is just an amenity. Retail, not as the driver of the development, because you need the other activities as well. I think it could be very attractive. I think people, you could probably make a case that there's a missing type of experience in this area that the workforce and the retired folks would actually enjoy. I think you could identify that. I think the question of whether the number is going to work for that that's the first part of thriving, and then not just the operating side, but really just getting the resources behind a project like that and the market confidence in it. But yeah, I think you could make a strong case that people are actually hungry for a different type of environment than most of the ones that are available to them in this particular part of the region.
Thank you, Ray.
however, if you look at some of the big sites that we threw out already that are similar in scale, Newberry, Southside Works, the Mills Mall, Century, even the ones that are somewhat successfully developed as mixed-use lifestyle centers are beyond struggling, right? Either development is completely stalled, or as the case with Southside Works, I think the new owner is going to do very, very well, but they had a tough challenge ahead of them before this, and they got a heck of a project on their hands now. I think they're the right people to do it, but yeah, I mean, I think that's the conversation. Market is so important because it is the driver, right?
Yeah. no, you can't fantasize about how it'll all work. I mean, but I think it's really, the question is there a part of the market that would be able to support like a tight group of amenity kind of driven business, not the kind of because Southside Works tried to have regular retail for years and then sort of realized that couldn't really happen, or the other more diverse type of retail. But I don't know the answer. I mean, I think that you're right. There's a lot of other sites that it should be attractive for this that are not, getting traction. Well, there's in fact Hazelwood Green itself in some ways. So with enormous resources behind it to try and make it work. So that these are real challenges. At the same time, if you can, you can't, you can't encourage people just to dream of the type of environment they want to have. At the same time, if you can't get some examples in your head, there's the very patient money version, which is really the South Point kind of version, which as Jared was saying, took a long time to kind of fill everything out in it, but is pulling through. It's still worth taking a look at.
If I could jump in real quick, the Lower Hill development has a 3-acre park, and we have a lot of common area. And one of the, obviously that's an $800 million development that's currently in progress, but it is anchored by PPG Paint Arena. And it's also anchored by Live Nation. We have a signed deal with those guys. And then we're anchored by the downtown, Duquesne University, and UPMC. The developers still look and say, what could I do with that 3 acres, right?
Yeah,
Making it a park is not the first thing on their minds, right? But the Penguins are like, no, it's going to be a park. So you really need something that really pulls you there to make that common area, that common space, that park space work within a development. And that's a 28-acre development pad, right?
Thank you, Jared. Keely, is there another question?
Yes, so we've mentioned all these different types of development that could occur. And someone asked, how do the expected tax revenues differ among these different potential site developments? And what kind of industries or developments would be expected to kind of maximize tax revenue? Any insight on tax revenue with these developments?
I mean, take an initial stab at that. Yeah, I mean, that's an important point here is that, there are land use considerations here, but there are also financial considerations as well. Roughly speaking, for every $100 million worth of assessed development, in Churchill, it would generate about $4 million in annual real estate revenue. About a fourth of that would go to Churchill Borough. And yes, there are drastically different kind of valuations amongst those different asset classes we talked about. And again, I mean, so we talked about the market for retail, and if you look at the tax environment in other retail places, what you have is vacancy going like this, assessed value going like this, and therefore tax receipts non-existent, right? In the worst case scenario, you have a place like Pittsburgh Mills Mall that has a giant financing associated with that. But even in the best case scenario, you just have a massive erosion of tax base, which is pretty scary for a lot of, especially our smaller municipalities. So yeah, I mean, certainly an office or an industrial user is going to be a much more viable, much more tax generative use. And, basically speaking, it's a valuation against construction value. So the higher construction value site, the more tax revenue you're going to produce. And that's money to offset any potential externalities or negative community impacts that the development would pose. So it is a trade-off, it's like buying a house, elements you like, elements you don't like, and then, what you can afford. So.
Does anybody else have some thoughts? Keely, do we have another question?
Yeah, so along the lines of the housing that we were discussing earlier, what are some of the newer forms of housing that you were referring to? I think Ray was referring to earlier.
Well, it was less, I mean, there are newer types of housing that are interesting, but what I'm really referring to is the mix of townhouses and rentals, almost and sort of both ownership townhouses and rentals that are happening in a place like Bakery Square, that mixes a kind of strong kind of rentals that are very, attractive rentals and have a high amenity level, together with townhouses, assuming that they're kind of going to serve both markets. This is at the high end of the market, what I'm describing. This is like it's similar to the way the development's happening in the Strip as well. And special projects like the ones we've just discussed before, which are like the one in Washington County. But that said, then so it's less about the housing types are ones we're all familiar with, townhouses, and right down to zero lot line kind of contemporary single family development. But my point is really that it's a housing which is developed in association with some kind of job center or amenity center, which makes it feel that it's an attractive from a kind of lifestyle perspective for the potential folks that would live there. And that's, I think that those we've seen them before, but we're doing them slightly differently and in new ways today that I think, the market will continue to provide this. And that mix of options, it seems to be something that is attractive to people to live in a neighborhood where there are everything from a townhouse, row house, to flats, to large flats, to small flats, to micro units. It's like that kind of thinking.
Does anybody else want to respond to that question? All right, Keely, any other questions?
Yes, so someone mentioned, what about something like the research lab area along the Mon River plus housing?
Wait, the research, you mean yes, the Pittsburgh Technology Center. Okay. Well, the Pittsburgh Technology Center now finally has a hotel and also has a little bit more variety in the type of what's being built there. They tried to put in some housing, and that project didn't quite work. But it's I agree. I mean, I don't think we're going to see a generation of kind of an R&D kind of office complex quite like the Pittsburgh Technology Center anytime soon. Just sort of because of where the but that said, it's really in many ways Lawrenceville and the Strip are the Pittsburgh Technology Center with housing. They just have more housing and more old stuff that was already there, and then the new offices are being sort of inserted in that. Some of them are actually very much an R&D kind of office. Others are now it's more towards Class A and parts of the Strip and so forth. So, or the traditional Class A. So yeah, no, I think that's worth thinking about. The only other thing I'd mention is because it's sort of my duty as representing Carnegie Mellon, is that there is, and I think I saw it in your comprehensive plan as a reference. I do think, I don't think that the world is ready for mass production of co-housing complexes, especially with the COVID situation. But I do think that there's different types of living arrangements, not just for seniors, in which there's more shared amenities. And again, this particular moment, it's a little hard to imagine whether the health concerns are going to get in the way of it. But this has been a trend which has gone from being kind of a fringe to being actually more seriously considered by developers. Even, sometimes it's just in that they put sort of 20 units into that have very small units that have shared services, which they find it's attractive for some of their customers. But I think there's also more structured versions. And of course, that's senior communities are essentially shared housing too. So I think there's models for housing that we haven't seen yet that are more cooperative in some ways than most of the model that we've had, especially in the suburbs for some time.
Yeah, I'll agree with Ray on that. So that PTC was kind of the first wave of R&D centers. The second wave, like you said, is really organically occurring on the backs of NREC in Lawrenceville. And I think that the challenge for replicating that is just the proximity to the research institutions is not there. I'm not going to suggest it's far away. I know it's only a couple of minutes down the road, but perception is key in this point. And I just don't think the perceived adjacency to the universities is there to support large-scale multi-tenant R&D development. Now, you could, as it was mentioned before, you could hit the lottery, and maybe somebody with R&D intensive plus office operation appears out of the blue and plunks down $500 million for a new, Apple headquarters. But I mean, I that would literally be like waiting around for the lottery. So I don't know that that's the best approach.
Thank you. I'm cognizant of the time, and I wanted to keep us moving along on our agenda. We're about to start our lightning round with the panelists. But before we do that, I'd like to invite Mr. Wilhelm to make a statement. He's representing the owner. And Tess, if you would unmute his mic.
Good evening, committee. My name is Jeff Wilhelm. I'm an attorney with Reed Smith. We represent Churchill Crossing Partners, LP. My colleague, Rachel O'Neill, who has appeared before you previously, has advised you that Churchill's Crossing is the owner of the former Westinghouse campus that is the subject of the workshops. On behalf of our client, we objected to this process, citing the demonstrable lack of transparency of the borough and its consultants, Pashik, with our client, the property owner, who unquestionably should have been included at the inception of this process. Despite targeting our client's property, neither the borough, the committee, nor Pashik mailed noticed or otherwise contacted our client regarding the workshops. The client was not consulted regarding the timetable of the workshops, the publication of the survey, the nature of the topic selected, or the selection of the presenters. The client and its access to expertise appears to have been intentionally and deliberately excluded from the process. Contrary to the prior assertion of Pashik in these workshops, the nature of the above statement is factual and not subject to debate. After my colleague expressed our client's objection, this committee acted commendably by inviting our client to provide input. By letter dated May 6, 2020, our client accepted the gracious invitation and proposed to assemble a panel of experts to discuss potential development of the property considering current and projected market conditions, and it intended to do so on a timetable shorter than Pashik was given by the borough to organize and present the workshops. So yes, the public and this committee should fully understand that the property owner made a reasonable request to present expertise and advice to this fact-finding committee. This letter was addressed to the committee via the borough manager and copied to Pashik. No response was forthcoming to our client's offer. At the recent borough council meeting, I understand a member of the public expressed interest in hearing from the property owner. Unlike the non-transparent answer of the two borough supervisors who responded, I will directly address this inquiry. The deeply disappointing and troublesome truth is that your elected leaders have intentionally excluded and hindered every effort of the property owner to meaningfully participate in this process. We want you to understand that this flawed process appears to be designed by the borough and its consultants to reach to a predetermined result without input from the property owner who pays taxes to this borough and who has spent significant amounts of its own money preparing this property for redevelopment. We continue to object to this flawed process and the effort of this borough and committee members to engage in a visiting process while wholly excluding the property owner. The borough and the committee's failure to respond and engage the property owner in this process is deeply disappointing and should be shocking to those who believe in a reasonable democratic fact-finding process. The members of the public who have participated in this process, we appreciate your interest and ask you the following question. Do you think the exclusion of the property owner would be the best way to discuss zoning or regulations pertaining to your own property? We again ask the borough and the members of the committee to do the right thing and pause this process to start working with our client, the taxpayer, instead of fighting against it. I ask that this statement be made part of the record. I appreciate the borough and the committee's time with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilhelm, and we will definitely include your statement if you could provide it as part of the record for this webinar. So next on our agenda is what we call the lightning round. It's kind of fun. The other webinars, the panelists have enjoyed this. We ask you as panelists to help us identify words or phrases that best illustrate the ideas and concepts that we have discussed tonight. We're going to have a whiteboard that goes up, and we'll record your thoughts. We'll go around as many times as we need to exhaust all the different ideas that you want. And then as we go through this, towards the end, we ask attendees to please use the question and answer button on the bottom bar for the Zoom, and submit your words as well, words or phrases, and we'll add those to the whiteboard. So I'd like to start with Nick, and if you would give me one word or phrase of something that captures what we've been talking about tonight.
Community buy-in.
Thank you. Jared.
Open communications.
Thank you. Ray.
I'm going to say remote work.
Remote work, that's going to have a huge impact in the future. Yes, thank you. Lance.
Market-based.
Thank you. We're back to you, Nick.
Partnerships.
Great. Jared.
Demographics.
Can you mention to me how you use demographics? I'm just to be clear.
Understanding the demographics within the community, household income, consumer buying power. I think school districts important when you're looking at demographics. That's what I mean by demographics.
Thank you.
Well,
Ray.
I'm going to say embodied carbon. Because
I'm sorry?
Embodied carbon. I mean, this is adaptive reuse is so much better for sustainability than new construction by almost any measure, that this is a really serious opportunity. I don't know enough about the conditions of the building, et cetera, to really beyond a few of them, but still, I think it's something. This is a lot of square footage which could be retrofit, from my understanding, and that's significantly better from a sustainability perspective.
Thank you, Ray. Lance, we're back to you.
One word phrase, opportunity costs, or opportunity. Just leave it at opportunity. How about that?
It's better. Sounds better.
In that this is a huge one and we shouldn't blow it and we should get it done.
Yeah. Make it happen. How about Nick?
I would say access, transportation access.
Good. Jared.
well, Nick took mine, but thanks. So I'm going to go with, because I was going to say ingress, egress, but I'll go with site analysis.
Great. Ray.
I'm going to go with Jared's word, experience.
Experience, yes. Lance.
Revenue.
Is there a specific thing that you're looking for in terms of what revenue means?
Sustainable tax revenue to a municipality that's probably staring down a really scary municipal budget. And school district and county budget. All of our taxing bodies. I'm speaking the royal we here.
Yeah. Terrific, thank you. Nick.
Sense of place.
What do you mean by sense of place? We had a whole webinar on it, but I'd be interested in your thoughts.
I mean, for me, it's creating, tying in with the current conditions and the current residents and the community itself, and making it sort of a home buy-in, just sort of a location or feel.
Yeah, great, thank you. Thank you very much. Jared.
Tenant demand.
Important part of the market. Thank you. How about Ray?
Water flows downhill. Man, in terms of stormwater, it shouldn't be that hard on this one, but water management is a site like this. It's critical.
Thank you, Lance.
I'll go excuse for improvement. And I mean, development offers us an excuse and a revenue source to make improvements in our communities that need to be made, and there's no way to do so. And I'm thinking about one, you know, developing that site would leave that site better off from an ecological perspective, from a community perspective, from a tax-based perspective, from a transportation network perspective. We have spots in this community that are extremely dangerous and problematic that we have the opportunity to fix by way of this development. And so it's an excuse to tackle all those issues.
Terrific. Thank you, Lance. Nick?
Pass.
I'm sorry?
Pass.
You're allowed. Jared, we're back to you.
Developers analysis.
Yes. All leads to feasibility, doesn't it?
It does.
Ray?
I'm just going to keep going on sustainability because it's not up there right now. It's up there, and but it can mean many things, but I'm actually referring to from an environmental perspective.
Great. Thank you. Lance, any more?
This was probably tackled in some of your other things, but we haven't talked a lot about the visibility of the site. It's an extremely visible site. So I'll say first impression, right? Right now, the first impression of that site is big old vacant site, keep moving, there's nothing happening here. And I don't think that's the message we want to send.
Yeah, it's quite an opportunity, isn't it?
Huge.
Jared?
Lance took mine, so that was mine. So I'm running thin here.
How about if we just throw it up to anybody? Are there any other words or phrases you'd like us to capture as we think about the market for this site?
Regional impact. I know this is Churchill's show, and I appreciate that. But from a regionalist perspective, this is about so much more than just Churchill. And I know they have to be responsible and they have to drive this bus, but there are a lot of other communities that are, as you mentioned, the whole point of this came out of a multi-municipal plan, right? So this is about the village as well.
Hey, Lance, let me jump in on it if I may. I worked on the Bakery Square project, and before we landed Google, it was a tough road getting retail and amenities and et cetera, et cetera. So I think, I would probably say, a very reputable developer / tenant. That's what I would say.
Great. Any other closing words? We've exhausted all of you. Is there any? Alrighty. So I'd like to thank our panelists. You guys have been terrific. It's just an amazing group of people that we've assembled, and you've done some amazing things in terms of sharing your thoughts about the market. I'd like to thank the attendees for coming. We've had a decent amount of people attending these. It's really important, and you've given us some thoughts and questions, and we appreciate that as well. I hope I have learned something from this panel discussion, and I hope you have as well. This session has been recorded along with the whiteboard list, so we'll be putting that on the website along with Mr. Wilhelm's statement. I'd like to thank everyone for participating tonight. And for those that you did, and the earlier webinars as well. So the next steps, this is where I usually say, stay tuned to the next webinar, but this was the last one. So what I would like to say in terms of next steps is that we will be working with the steering committee to talk about how this all evolves into a vision for the community. And we'll be presenting that to council this summer sometime. So thank you so much for doing it. This was a great panel, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right, bye-bye.
Yeah, this was fun. Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.